Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Ben here. I am back again today doing another video. And the subject of today's video is going to be on the Houston Rockets again, just like a video I did a little while ago. It's going to be focused on Chris Paul mainly. So if you don't know, Daryl Morey about a week ago proclaimed that he is willing to trade any player on the Rockets to improve. He said basically, with the exception of James Harden, but if it's the right deal, he'll trade anybody. But the main two players that people are focusing on potentially getting dealt are Chris Paul and Clint Capella. So in a previous video, I covered potential Clint Capella trade scenarios, and today I will be looking at some Chris Paul trade scenarios that I've whipped up. So a quick overview of Chris Paul's stats last season. He averaged a career low in points per game at 15.6. He averaged a career low in field goal percentage at 42%. Shot 36% from the field, which is actually one of the lowest of his careers. It's like his fourth lowest of his 14 seasons. Let's see here. Field goal percentage, 86%, so right at his career average. 5 rebounds a game and 8 assists a game, which is the third lowest of his career. 2 steals a game, and so across the board, a down season for Chris Paul, definitely, but he was also hurt for some of it, and he is just generally getting older. So, with regard to that, you can understand it, but still a valuable player, a guy who has a really high basketball IQ, and for the right team, he can be a very valuable piece. So, the first deal I have here is Chris Paul going to the Dallas Mavericks in exchange for Tim Hardaway Jr., Courtney Lee, and Justin Jackson. So why would the Rockets do this deal? Basically, they need to improve their depth, I've been really realizing. They only play about 7 guys in the playoffs, and I just think that they could really benefit from having more guys that they could rely on. With this trade, you get 3 guys really that you could play in your rotation, and I think Tim Hardaway Jr. or Courtney Lee could start right away at small forward, and so hypothetically, your starting lineup could be something like, well, actually, Justin Jackson would probably be the most likely to start out of this group at small forward. He just probably wouldn't play major minutes, but your starting lineup for the Rockets after this could look something like um, James Harden, Courtney Lee, Justin Jackson, PJ Tucker, and Clint Capella. And then off the bench, you could have a really strong bench unit of Eric Gordon, Tim Hardaway Jr., Fareed, and Nene, which to me would be a really promising bench. So basically, they just get a lot more depth and a lot more viable options as far as wings that they could play, besides just Harden and Eric Gordon, who's pretty undersized if you're putting him at small forward. As for Dallas, you're basically trading a bunch of players that overlap with skill sets you already have, in that they already have Luka Doncic, who basically does anything that Tim Hardaway Jr. can do, but better. And Courtney Lee, he's good, but you can replace his skill set with people you have already on the roster. So if you're Dallas next year, your starting lineup is probably looking, and you get Chris Paul back, who is a much better player than any of those three, still in my opinion. And so you get back Chris Paul. Your starting lineup's probably going to look something like Chris Paul at the point. Then it could be a combination of players, but I actually probably would say Luka at shooting guard or small forward. He played a lot of small forward last year, but he could feasibly play anywhere between the 1 to the 3. So let's say Luka at shooting guard, or maybe they'll sign a shooting guard, but either way, between one of the wing positions, they're going to have to sign a player with some of their cap space. So Chris Paul, Luka Doncic, free agent to be determined. Power forward is probably power forward and center. You could put either player at either spot. It's going to be Dwight Powell and Kristaps Porzingis, presuming that they re-sign Porzingis, which everyone thinks that they will. And so you got a pretty formidable big three there between. Even if they sign a good free agent too, like let's say that they sign like a Chris Middleton, just hypothetically, then your starting lineup would feature a big four of Chris Paul, Chris Middleton, Luka, and Porzingis. That would be a pretty solid team to be looking at right there. So I can see why both teams would do this. The Mavericks, from gaining leadership and just more of a trading 3/4 for a dollar, would basically be what they'd be doing. they would be trading a lot of their depth for just basically one player, but lots of teams do that, so I could see why they would do it. And then for the Rockets, you're getting the exact opposite. You're trading the one player for the depth, which is really what they need at this point, I think, considering that Chris Paul, basically James Harden can do everything Chris Paul can, but better, and you get these wings that can um, be spot up shooters a little bit better than Chris Paul, who more needs the ball in his hands to be effective. Next trade I have here is just a straight up swap between the Pacers and the Rockets. Chris Paul for Miles Turner. Why would Indiana do this? They really need a point guard. They have had Darren Collison running the show, but with all due respect to him, I think he's more of a good backup rather than an. As a starter, he's average to mediocre, but as a backup, he's really good. So I'd rather have him as a backup. He actually did formerly back up Chris Paul in Los Angeles, but you'd have Chris Paul and Oladipo who would form, you could argue, the best defensive backcourt in the league. And he'd also be a really good leader for a team that's trying to make it far in the playoffs. So you'd have that. He would actually complement Oladipo well, and that I think neither Oladipo doesn't completely need the ball all the time to be effective. So I think that having Chris Paul be not ball dominant, but controlling the ball a decent amount of the time wouldn't be half bad. And then you could have Darren Collison come off the bench and be a one or even a backup as a two as well. But this Pacers team has a lot of cap space because between Collison, Bogdanovich, Thad Young, Corey Joseph, Kyle O'Quinn, all being free agents, that totals up to 45 million in cap space. So they would be losing a lot of money, having Turner making only 3 million traded for Chris Paul's 35, but they have 45 million to deal with, so they're essentially gaining 32 million dollars, and that still leaves them with 11 million in cap space to sign somebody else, maybe to fill in at the power forward or center void that Miles Turner would be leaving. But still, they would have Sabonis, so they would be fine if they just re-signed another power forward or center, as I say. As for Houston, you get a guy who's much younger in Miles Turner than Chris Paul. You get to a lot of the value that Chris Paul brings, Miles Turner would replace, but in a different way. So Chris Paul brings like assists and scoring to the table, and Miles Turner more brings like floor spacing and defense to the table. And so you'd be getting a different skill set back, but you'd be getting a comparable skill set back. Your starting lineup for the Rockets after this would look something like um, probably uh, James Harden at the point, then probably at shooting guard. If they don't want to start Eric Gordon, you'd probably have Gerald Green. But if they do start Eric Gordon, then your main five is going to be James Harden, Eric Gordon, PJ Tucker, Miles Turner at the power forward, and then Clint Capella at center. So and then you could run a lot of lamps with Miles Turner at the center with Clint Capella out of the game, and because he can floor space and shoot threes, you don't have to go small ball all the time. If you want to do a space and pace, you can play the 6'11 center Miles Turner who can step out and take a three and not feel bad or uncomfortable with that. And so I think that opens up a lot of new options for this team as well. Next, I have one that I actually really like a lot, and I think it benefits both teams and that they're both potentially better off, and that is Chris Paul to the Denver Nuggets in exchange for Will Barton and Gary Harris. So let's cover Denver first. Paul Millsap's contract is up after the season. He's making 30 million, and so they'll have a lot of cap space because he'll be out of there. So they basically have $30 million to deal with. And in this deal, they take basically between the players they're giving away and getting Chris Paul, they're gaining an additional 7 million. But from that Paul Millsap 30, that still leaves them with 23 million to go out and sign somebody else. Cough, cough, Chris Middleton, who would be perfect for this team. Um, or Chris Middleton or Tobias Harris, I would love on this team. And I don't think it's outrageous to say, um, like 23 million. I think that's super fair value for a Chris Middleton. He probably will want more, but if he's talked into it, I think that you could get him to that number. Tobias Harris, it might be hard to get to that number, but I think he thinks pretty highly of himself now after the season he had. But 23 million would be very fair for him too. So let's hypothetically say that they were to sign Tobias Harris after this deal. Your starting lineup would be Chris Paul at the point, Jamal Murray at the two guard, which he can play. Small forward, you would have Torrey Craig or Malik Beasley or Michael Porter Jr. if he's healthy. Power forward, you would have Tobias Harris, and then center, you'd have Nikola Jokic. So essentially a big four of Chris Paul, Jamal Murray, Tobias Harris, and Nikola Jokic, and that to me would be a really solid starting, like a core four. And then on the other side for Houston, I think again this trade works in that you get a lot of good depth for this team. Your starting lineup after this trade would probably be James Harden, Gary Harris, Will Barton, uh, PJ Tucker, and Clint Capella, and then you'd have Eric Gordon off the bench. So you would again finally get a solution to that small forward void that they've had all season last year, where they were like, maybe Gerald Green. Maybe we start Eric Gordon, who's 6'3" at small forward, where he's going to be facing 6'9" guys. Maybe we do Iman Shumpert, whose same problem is only 6'4". Gerald Green's a little too skinny to be playing against some small forwards like LeBron or Paul George or Durant. He's too short. And I think that this would be a good solution. Will Barton is only 6'6", but he's played a lot of small forward. He's used to the position. He's used to facing off against those guys. He's good for 12 to 13 points a game on decent shooting. Gary Harris, same sort of deal. He's just a good solid shooting guard, and he's not going to score you 50, or excuse me, not 50. He's not going to score you 25 a night, but he's going to give you 16 on decent shooting numbers. And with James Harden, you only need a few guys. If you can have Gordon, Barton, Capella, Gary Harris all scoring 15 a night next to Harden's 30, you're going to look really solid. So this is definitely the trade that I love the most of these Chris Paul trades. Next, I have a weird one, and you'll just have to stick with me for it, because it maybe initially doesn't make sense, but trust me, in the long run, it will. So after Iman Shumpert's contract comes off the books, the Rockets will have, along with a few other guys coming off the books, the Rockets will have about $13 million in cap space. And so they will have some flexibility financially to take on a little bit more money than they would have initially thought, maybe. But the trade I have here is Chris Paul to the Timberwolves in exchange for Jeff Teague, Gorgui Dieng, and Dario Saric. Now those contracts line up essentially perfectly, and so they'll be still left with about 12 to 13 million in cap space if you're the Rockets to sign somebody else. But so I'll go through Minnesota first, because theirs is easier to explain why they do this. They get an upgrade at point guard, definitely, with Chris Paul over Teague. He's an upgrade, but he's not that drastic of an upgrade. But I just think his experience and IQ will make up for Teague being younger and Teague being younger and more athletic and stuff like that. And so you basically get a really good leader for a team that I think needs a really good leader, and they just have been lacking that. And a good veteran who isn't moody like Jimmy Butler. So you'd have a starting lineup after this of Chris Paul, probably Andrew Wiggins, Robert Covington, Cat would be at center, and then your power forward is probably, it's hard to tell, if they re-sign Taj Gibson, it'll be Taj Gibson, and if not, it'll probably be like Anthony Tolliver or somebody else they were to bring in, and then you'd again have Derrick Rose off the bench. So pretty good unit. I'd say better than this current year. And then on the Rockets side, you get Jeff Teague, who actually, if you look at his numbers, with what Chris Paul put up last year, that's basically right where Teague puts up. So Chris Paul last year put up 16 points a game along with 8 assists a game. And Jeff Teague usually puts up about 15 points and 8 assists a game. So he's actually pretty similar to what Chris Paul was last year. Actually very similar. Along with that, you get a really good backup center in Gorgui Dieng, and then you get floor spacing in Dario Saric, who I think could help this team a lot. Starting lineup for the Rockets after this would probably look like Jeff Teague, James Harden, PJ Tucker, Dario Saric, and Clint Capella, with Gorgui Dieng, Kenneth Faried, and Eric Gordon coming off the bench. So again, you shore up your small forward in that you can put floor spacing in Dario Saric at the 4, and then you can slide PJ Tucker back to his more natural 3. and I think that that works out pretty well. You get a guy who can basically replace Chris Paul with Jeff Teague, and his money will come off the books after this year, and so you'll gain about $20 million there. And then essentially in the long term, this is why the Rockets would do this, is that they're just getting rid of that Chris Paul money so much easier. Um, so after next season, they'd basically only be left with the 2 years of Gorgie Jang, and actually it would only be after next season there would only be 1 year left of Jang, where at 15, whereas you would still have 2 years left of Chris Paul at 35, or actually up to about 40 to 42 at that point. So you would be freeing up a lot of money that you would have otherwise had on the books. And let's see, next summer you're gonna have guys like who were in the class of 2016 as free agents. So I'm trying to think here who you'd have like a Ben Simmons as a free agent. You'd have Brandon Ingram. Not that they would go after those guys in particular, but you're just going to have your whole new crop of guys who are going to be free agents. And um, the people who signed during the summer of 16 will be off the books. So you'll have a lot of dudes coming off the books again who um, you could sign as well. They just have a lot more options if they did this trade in the future. This last trade here I actually like a lot. Again, between the it's a three-way deal actually between the Rockets, Magic, and Celtics. So in this trade, the Rockets send Chris Paul to Orlando, and Orlando in exchange does a sign and trade, sending Nikola Vucevic to Houston, and then they also send Evan Fournier. Basically, it would just be like the Rockets signing Vucevic and then also getting trading Fournier for Chris Paul. But just because the salaries would work better that way, I said it would be a sign and trade. But it's basically Rockets signing Nikola Vucevic and then trading Chris Paul's 35 million for Evan Fournier's 17. But you would have to do it as a sign and trade just to make the contracts line up. Um, but I think a lot of people would assume that if the Magic are gonna pay pretty heftily if they want to re-sign Vucevic, maybe like 25 or more $1 million per year. And I don't know if Vucevic is really worth that when you have a young guy like Mo Bamba waiting in the wings to start. So I think it would be a good move to let Vucevic walk and then just finally give Mo Bamba, after a whole year of basically being a backup and playing minimal minutes, he finally gets to start and prove that he was worth being the sixth pick in the draft. So for Orlando, after this trade, your starting lineup would look like Chris Paul. Oh, I forgot to mention, you also have Terrence Ross as your backup to Evan Fournier, and he could definitely start for this team. So it's not really a huge concern to lose Fournier, in my opinion. So you'd have a starting lineup of Chris Paul, Terrence Ross, small forward be Jonathan Isaac, power forward Aaron Gordon, and then center Mo Bamba. So uh, they finally fill their void of point guard on the Orlando Magic, which they've had for about the last 2+ years. So I think that this would be a good trade for them in that respect. And then they also get rid of some of their um, overlapping skill sets and positions, in that you clear out Vucevic to make room for Bamba. And then the thing I was thinking about was then you have Vucevic on the Rockets, but him and Capella I don't think would really mesh together. So I had then Capella going to the Celtics in exchange for Jaylen Brown. I think that's a pretty fair trade. Jaylen Brown's about 24. I think Clint Capella is also 24 or 25. I think they're a similar talent level right now, and I just think that that's a pretty fair trade all around. And so basically, at the end of the day, you have the Celtics who have traded. Oh, also, they have such a roadblock at wing that I think it would be useful to clear one of those wing players, and you get a center who's an immediate upgrade over Aaron Baines and can start all the time. So for the Celtics after this trade, let's presume that they don't re-sign Kyrie. Your starting lineup is going to probably look like Terry Rozier, Jason Tatum, Gordon Hayward, Al Horford, and Clint Capella, which is still a competitive team that could make the playoffs. Your starting lineup for Orlando, I already went over, and then the Rockets definitely make out the best in this trade. They end up with, in my opinion, they end up the best in this trade. Their starting lineup would look like James Harden at point, Evan Fournier at shooting guard, Jaylen Brown at small forward, power forward PJ Tucker, and center Nikola Vucevic, with again Eric Gordon off the bench. So it doesn't like they don't get more rotational guys in this trade. I think that they just shore up. Um, like the small forward, as I've said throughout this whole video, small forward was just such an issue last year for the Rockets. They really had nobody that they could trust playing there. I think I like the rotation of Jaylen Brown and maybe Evan Fournier switching off there a lot more than what they've had currently. You get Chris Paul's horrendous contract off the books. You get a center who you could argue is better in Vucevic, who's an all-star. He can space the floor for you, which Capella could not do. And he's just a much better overall offensive player. His defense is a lot worse, but I think his offense makes up for that. And that's all I really got for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you found it interesting and entertaining. If you have trade scenarios of your own that you want to present to me, feel free. Go ahead. I'd love to hear them. Again, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I hope you have a good day. See you again next time. Bye.